All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to break down the incredibly complex origins and early campaigns of the Crusades. We're going to strip away centuries of myth and look directly at the actual historical forces that ignited what was, quite literally, one of the most consequential conflicts in human history. So, let's start by asking the core question that drives this entire narrative. What actually possessed tens of thousands of medieval Europeans to just abandon their homes, walk thousands of miles into the total unknown, and fight and die in a foreign land? Well, it wasn't just a sudden whim. It was a perfect storm of faith, fear, and severely fractured empires.
To make sense of all this, here's the path we're taking today. 1. The fractured world. 2. The spark of war. 3. Zealots and princes. 4. Conquering the Holy Land. 5. Fragile new kingdoms. And 6. The Second Crusade.
Okay, part 1. The fractured world, setting the tinder. Before we go any further, it is absolutely crucial to get our terminology straight. You see, the people we're talking about, they didn't actually use the word crusade. That term wasn't really established until the 1700s. Instead, they thought of what they were doing as an iter or passagium, literally a journey or a passage. It was fundamentally viewed as an armed pilgrimage. The participants sewed cloth crosses onto their clothes and became known as crucis signati, or those signed with a cross.
To understand their mindset, you have to realize that the medieval fear of damnation was profound. It was terrifying and it was very, very real. In this era, the idea of sin permeated absolutely every aspect of daily life, and believers were desperately seeking penance to avoid hell. Traveling to Jerusalem was considered the ultimate penitential journey, a way to literally walk off your sins. But getting there was becoming increasingly dangerous.
And why was it dangerous? Well, zoom out for a second and look at the geopolitical map. It was completely fracturing. A period of severe drought and cold spells had triggered famine and mass migration across Central Asia and the Middle East. You have nomadic Seljuk Turkomans sweeping in, which drastically disrupts the whole region. When the Byzantines were crushed at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, their control over Anatolia just collapsed, creating this massive power vacuum. Down in Egypt, the ruling Fatimid Caliphate was totally paralyzed by a bloody succession crisis. The East was in chaos, fundamentally divided, right at the exact moment Western popes were consolidating their own power.
Which brings us to part 2, the spark of war, Pope Urban's call.
So, in late 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexios reaches out to the west asking for military aid against the encroaching Turkomans, and Pope Urban II completely seizes the moment. At the Council of Claremont that November, he delivers a speech that literally changes history. He channeled all that deep European anxiety over sin we just talked about and directed it into an orchestrated military campaign. He urged knights to stop fighting each other and instead go aid Eastern Christians. And the kicker? He promised immense spiritual rewards, the absolute remission of sins for those who made the journey.
The reaction from the crowd was absolutely electric. People started shouting, Deus vult, God wills it. It wasn't just an enthusiastic response, it became a rallying cry that sparked a massive, uncontrollable chain reaction across the entire European continent. What the Pope originally intended to be a tightly controlled military aid mission, actually, scratch that. It instantly transformed into a mass popular movement that no one could control.
Moving on to part 3, Zealots and Princes, a tale of two armies.
Because the Pope's message didn't just reach the trained warriors he was targeting, it spread to the commoners. Enter a highly charismatic figure named Peter the Hermit. He went around preaching in areas the Pope had entirely bypassed, and he attracted tens of thousands of unauthorized peasants and townsfolk. This unsanctioned movement, which we call the People's Crusade, turned chaotic really quickly. Driven by a wildly misguided zeal, splinter groups of this movement unleashed horrific anti-Semitic massacres in the Rhineland. And when the surviving throngs finally stumbled into Anatolia in late 1096, they were swiftly and decisively annihilated by Seljuk forces at Civitate.
So you really have to look at the stark contrast between that doomed peasant-led mob and the highly organized forces that followed shortly after. The Prince's Crusade was a completely different beast. Now, it didn't involve any actual kings, mostly due to ongoing political tensions with the church, but it was led by incredibly powerful nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon and Bohemond of Taranto. These guys were highly financed, heavily armed, and they were veteran commanders.
All right, part 4, conquering the Holy Land, the Bloody March.
Just think about the sheer geographical scale of what happened next. We are talking about an unbelievable logistical feat for the 11th century.
You have a host of 60,000 to 100,000 people. That included maybe 7,000 elite knights, but also an astonishing 30,000 non-combatants. They marched thousands of miles from Western Europe down through the Balkans, navigated a really tense political standoff at Constantinople, and then plunged straight into hostile Anatolian territory.
Tracking their progression chronologically, it's just a grueling, exceptionally violent slog. They captured Nicaea in June 1097. Then came the Siege of Antioch. This was a brutal 8-month nightmare of famine and disease that they barely survived before miraculously defeating a massive relief army. Finally, in the intense summer heat of 1099, they breached the walls of Jerusalem. And what followed was a brutal 2-day slaughter of the city's inhabitants, marking a truly horrific conclusion to their 3-year march.
But despite all this appalling violence, when we look at the physical remnants left behind, like the hundreds of crosses carved deep into the stone of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's a powerful, granular reminder of the deep religious convictions fueling this massive human movement. These thousands of individuals genuinely, truly believed that their harrowing journey and the bloodshed were earning them eternal salvation.
Part 5. Fragile New Kingdoms, Holding the Line.
So, through their conquests, the Crusaders established 4 isolated Latin states in the Levant: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and eventually the County of Tripoli. But taking the territory was one thing. Holding it was a totally different nightmare. Geographically, these states were essentially highly militarized islands surrounded by hostile neighbors. Their creation effectively locked Western Europe into a long-term commitment. They now had to constantly resupply and defend them for decades to come.
When Baldwin of Bologna was crowned as the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem's first monarch, he faced an incredible challenge. Once the primary vows were fulfilled after taking Jerusalem, the vast majority of the crusading army just packed up and went home. Baldwin was left desperately trying to consolidate his rule and expand his borders with an incredibly small force. To put it in perspective, at one point, he had just 300 knights and 2,000 foot soldiers to defend the entire kingdom. No way, right? But it's true.
So, to solve this severe manpower shortage, they came up with an entirely new concept: the warrior monk. Facing frequent deadly attacks on traveling pilgrims, leaders met at the Council of Nablus in 1120, which led directly to the creation of the military orders. Groups like the Knights Templar, who got their name from their headquarters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Franks believed was Solomon's temple, were sworn to poverty and chastity, but were also fully dedicated to shedding blood in defense of the Holy Land.
Which leads us to Part 6, the Second Crusade, a shattered invincibility. Fast forward a few decades to 1144, and the unthinkable happens for the West. The Turkoman commander Zengi successfully besieges and captures Edessa, wiping out the very first of the Crusader states. This shocking loss prompts a massive response. Pope Eugenius calls for a second crusade, and this time the kings actually answer the call. Specifically, King Louis VII of France, accompanied by the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, and King Conrad III of Germany. But their massive, uncoordinated armies suffered heavily on the long march east. The whole campaign culminated in a spectacular strategic failure, a completely botched siege of Damascus in 1148 that forced them into a humiliating retreat.
The clashes during the Second Crusade, particularly in Anatolia, were absolutely chaotic and devastating. Unlike the stunning successes of 1099, this crusade was, honestly, an unmitigated disaster. It gravely weakened crusading fervor back in Europe, and perhaps most importantly, it completely shattered that aura of divine invincibility that the Western Knights had held in the East up until that point.
So, let's wrap up this explainer with a lingering, provocative thought. The Second Crusade proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Western presence in the Levant was incredibly vulnerable. With European fervor severely dampened and a newly inspired, unifying Muslim world witnessing that these crusaders could indeed be beaten, the stage was perfectly set. How did this failure lay the direct groundwork for the rise of Saladin, the devastating Battle of Hattin, and a seemingly endless, centuries-long cycle of holy war? Well, that is a huge question to think about. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.